My childhood had been a bubble of warmth and security, a world that seemed untouched by the harsh realities of life. Dad, Richard, was the cornerstone of that happiness. He had a way of turning ordinary moments into cherished memories. Every fishing trip, every bedtime story, and every lesson in fixing things around the house made me feel invincible. It was as if he'd built a fortress around me, one that shielded me from the world's storms. That fortress crumbled when he died. I was 10 when it happened. The memories of that day are blurred, as if my mind refuses to let them resurface fully. I remember the heaviness in the air, the hushed tones of adults, and the way my mother, Catherine, clung to me with trembling hands. Dad's death was sudden, a cruel twist of fate that robbed us of his steady presence. He left behind not just a void in our lives, but also a modest inheritance, the house and enough savings to ensure a comfortable life, or so I thought. For a while, it felt like we were navigating grief together. Mom seemed fragile but determined, as if she wanted to honor Dad by keeping our lives on track. But slowly, things began to change. Her grief took a different form, one that I couldn't understand at the time. Then came Mike. Mike was everything Dad wasn't. He was loud, brash, and had a way of inserting himself into spaces where he wasn't needed. At first, he was just a friend helping Mom cope. I didn't think much of it, but it wasn't long before their relationship deepened. Within a year, they were married, and our house, once a sanctuary, became something else entirely. Mike didn't come alone. He brought his 2 children, Brandon and Haley, into our lives. They were close to my age, and I'd naively hoped we might bond, but that hope faded quickly. They weren't looking for a brother, they were claiming territory. The house seemed to shrink as they took over every corner, from the living room to the backyard. My room became my refuge, the last place that felt like mine. Mom's focus shifted entirely to her new family. At first, I told myself she was just trying to make them feel welcome, but as months passed, it became clear that I was no longer a priority. She started brushing off my attempts to spend time with her, always too busy attending to Mike or his kids. Even my room wasn't safe from their encroachment. Boxes of Haley's clothes and Brandon's toys began piling up in one corner, slowly swallowing the space. It felt like I was being erased. The worst part was the small, everyday indignities. Brandon would borrow my things without asking and return them broken or not at all. Haley's loud arguments with Mom echoed through the walls, making it impossible to concentrate on anything. And Mike's dismissive attitude made it clear he saw me as an inconvenience rather than a part of the family. Whenever I tried to speak up, Mom would wave me off, her voice laced with irritation. It was as if she couldn't see how much it hurt to be sidelined in my own home. Amid the chaos, my grandfather George and Aunt Elizabeth became my lifelines. Grandpa, with his steady voice and endless patience, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt since Dad passed. Aunt Elizabeth's house, filled with books and the smell of freshly baked cookies, became my haven. They listened when I spoke and never made me feel like I was competing for their attention. They reminded me that I still had a place where I mattered. Yet, every time I returned home, the sense of loss hit me anew. The house that once held the echoes of Dad's laughter now felt suffocating, filled with voices that drowned out my own. It was as if I'd become a stranger in the only home I'd ever known. I didn't understand it fully then, but something inside me was shifting. The seeds of resentment, confusion, and a longing for escape were being sown, and it was only a matter of time before they took root. The weeks leading up to my 18th birthday passed in a strange blur. Grandpa George's visits had become more frequent, and during one of them, he brought up something I hadn't thought about in years: Dad's inheritance. He reminded me that soon, the house would officially be mine, the one thing Dad had left to secure my future. At the time, it felt almost surreal. The house that had once been a fortress of love now felt like a battleground, its walls holding more resentment than memories. Catherine's announcement came a few days before my birthday. She casually mentioned over dinner, if it could even be called a dinner, given that I'd been left to reheat leftovers from the night before, that she, Mike, Brandon, and Haley were heading off on a week-long vacation. Her tone was flat, devoid of any acknowledgement that her eldest son's birthday fell smack in the middle of their plans. It wasn't the first time her priorities had been clear, but this hit differently. There wasn't even a pretense of concern for how I might feel. She didn't ask if I had plans, didn't offer an excuse. It was as if I didn't exist. The morning of my birthday was as cold and unremarkable as I felt. I woke up to an empty house, the silence almost mocking in its intensity. The fridge was nearly empty, save for some wilted lettuce, a half-eaten container of takeout, and a carton of milk that was well past its expiration date. It was a fitting metaphor for how I felt, discarded, forgotten, left to fend for myself in a space that no longer felt like home. I spent the morning wandering the house, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Memories of better times flitted through my mind, taunting me. The living room where Dad and I had built a fort out of couch cushions now held Mike's oversized recliner and Brandon's gaming setup. The backyard, once our sanctuary for summer barbecues, was now dominated by Haley's trampoline and plastic pool. Every corner of the house screamed that it no longer belonged to me, and yet, it was supposed to be mine. By midday, I had resigned myself to the idea that this birthday would pass like any other day, a quiet, lonely marker of time. Then came the knock at the door. When I opened it, Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth stood there, their arms laden with a cake, balloons, and a few brightly wrapped presents. The sight of them, their smiles warm and genuine, felt like a lifeline. For the first time in years, I felt seen. They didn't just bring gifts. They brought stories. As we sat around the dining table, Grandpa recounted tales of Dad's mischievous childhood and his relentless determination to provide for his family. Aunt Elizabeth shared anecdotes about how Dad's laughter could fill a room and how he'd once saved a stray dog from a storm just to see me smile. It was as if they were weaving a tapestry of memories to remind me of the man I came from, the legacy I carried. As the day stretched into the evening, Grandpa grew serious. He handed me a small stack of papers, his expression a mix of pride and solemnity. These, he explained, were the documents that transferred ownership of the house to me. The moment was heavy, not with sadness, but with the weight of responsibility. For so long, the house had felt like a symbol of everything I'd lost. Now, it was being handed back to me, not just as a reminder of my past, but as a promise for my future. Holding those papers, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't an immediate resolution, nor was it a burst of clarity. It was more like a quiet realization that I was at a crossroads. The house was mine, but so was the decision of what to do with it. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of control, a faint spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim what had been taken from me. As Grandpa and Aunt Elizabeth left that evening, their warmth lingering in the air long after the door closed behind them, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt different now. It wasn't just a place of loss and intrusion anymore. It was a canvas, blank and waiting for me to decide what story it would tell next. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of what that story might be. Catherine and her family returned from their vacation as if nothing had happened. Laughter and chatter filled the house, the sound grating in its indifference. Brandon and Haley dashed to their rooms, dragging along bags and souvenirs. Mike settled on the couch with his feet up, flipping through the channels like a king reclaiming his throne. Catherine barely acknowledged me. She asked nothing about my birthday, didn't notice the remains of the cake Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth had brought, or the faint scent of candles that still lingered in the air. The message was clear, my existence was a mere afterthought. That evening, as the house returned to its usual chaos, something inside me shifted. I had tolerated this for too long, the constant encroachment, the dismissal of my feelings, the gradual erasure of my identity in my own home. That night, I made a decision, I wouldn't live like this anymore. The house was mine, and it was time they understood that. The next morning, I waited until Catherine was alone in the kitchen, sorting through mail. I told her plainly that things had to change, that this wasn't just their house to take over. The words felt foreign yet empowering. I told her that if they couldn't respect the space and me as a person, they would have to leave. Her reaction was immediate and sharp. She dismissed my words, laughing in disbelief. She accused me of being ungrateful and dramatic, twisting my grievances into a personal attack. Mike joined in, drawn by the rising tension. He leaned against the doorway with a smug expression, throwing out sarcastic remarks that only fueled my anger. He mocked the very idea that I, a teenager, could dictate terms to them. To him, I was just a kid clinging to a fantasy of authority. The conversation escalated into a heated argument, their voices growing louder, their words more cutting. They didn't take me seriously, and that stung more than anything. I left the house that afternoon, frustration boiling over. I needed support, someone to validate my feelings and guide me forward. Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth welcomed me with open arms, their calm presence a balm to my frayed nerves. I explained everything, from Catherine's indifference to the conflict with Mike. They listened without interruption, their faces reflecting both sympathy and quiet determination. Grandpa George's wisdom shone through as he began laying out a plan. He reminded me of the documents he had handed over, the ones that gave me full ownership of the house. Together, we reviewed my rights, ensuring I understood the authority I now held. Aunt Elizabeth suggested seeking legal advice to solidify my position, and that's how Mr. Walsh, a family friend and lawyer, entered the picture. Mr. Walsh confirmed that I had every right to assert control over the property and take action against those who refused to respect my terms. Armed with this newfound clarity and the unwavering support of my family, I returned home that evening. It was time to act. The next day, I drafted an official notice of eviction, a move that felt both daunting and liberating. Grandpa George helped me refine the wording, ensuring it was firm yet respectful. Aunt Elizabeth stood by, her encouragement steadying my resolve. The final document was a tangible symbol of my stand against the toxic environment that had overshadowed my life for years. Handing the notice to Catherine was a moment I'll never forget. Her disbelief turned to anger as she read the words, her face a storm of emotions. Mike's reaction was predictable, more mockery, more attempts to belittle me. But this time, I didn't falter. I had the law on my side, and more importantly, I had reclaimed my voice. For the first time, I felt like the house was truly mine again, not just in name but in reality. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my room, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The battle was far from over, but this was the first step toward freedom, the first crack in the walls of their dominance. I wasn't just fighting for the house, I was fighting for myself, for the life Dad had wanted me to have. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was winning. The days following the eviction notice were a whirlwind of defiance from Catherine and Mike. They pretended the document didn't exist, carrying on with their routines as if nothing had changed. But their passive-aggressive tactics spoke volumes. I began to find notes scattered around the house, sticky notes left on mirrors, counters, and even on my bedroom door. They were filled with sarcastic comments and jabs about how immature and ungrateful I was. These notes weren't just words, they were weapons, aimed at chipping away at my resolve. The house became a battlefield of chaos. Catherine and Mike ramped up the tension by deliberately making messes. The living room, once neatly organized, was now strewn with Brandon's video game equipment and Haley's craft supplies. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, and Mike's muddy work boots left tracks across the floors I'd just cleaned. It was a calculated move, a way to reclaim dominance over a space they knew was slipping from their grasp. But I refused to back down. With Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth's help, I began reclaiming the house bit by bit. We started by boxing up items that didn't belong, Brandon's broken toys, Haley's discarded art projects, and Mike's cluttered tools. Each box felt like a small victory, a step toward restoring the house to what it had been before they arrived. As the clutter disappeared, so did the hold their presence had over me. Word of the eviction spread quickly through the family. Catherine, ever the manipulator, reached out to relatives with her version of the story. She painted me as an ungrateful son who was disrespecting his mother's sacrifices. At first, the backlash was overwhelming. Calls and messages from extended family poured in, their words echoing Catherine's accusations. It felt like I was being attacked from all sides. Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth urged me to face these accusations head-on. They invited key relatives over, creating a space for me to share my side of the story. It was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. I explained everything, the years of neglect, the way I'd been pushed aside for Mike's family, and the chaos they'd brought into the home. I didn't sugarcoat my emotions or hold back on the impact Catherine's indifference had had on me. To my surprise, many relatives listened. Some even apologized for jumping to conclusions. While not everyone was convinced, I found allies among the family who offered their support. It was a small but meaningful victory, a reminder that truth had power, even in the face of manipulation. As the eviction deadline approached, the atmosphere in the house grew unbearable. Catherine's behavior swung between icy silence and explosive arguments. Mike, ever the provocateur, went out of his way to antagonize me, leaving passive-aggressive comments hanging in the air like toxic smoke. Brandon and Haley mirrored their father, their actions childish but cutting. The tension was suffocating, but I clung to my determination like a lifeline. This wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about standing up for myself and reclaiming the life I deserved. The final week was a test of endurance. Each day felt heavier than the last, the emotional swings taking their toll. But I had no intention of backing down. I spent my evenings with Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth, drawing strength from their unwavering support. Mr. Walsh kept in close contact, ensuring everything was in place for the eviction to proceed smoothly. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not when victory was so close. The day of the eviction arrived with a cold, gray sky that matched the mood in the house. Grandpa George and Mr. Walsh accompanied me, their presence a steadying force. Catherine greeted us at the door, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation. She tried one last time to manipulate the situation, her words a tangled mess of guilt-tripping and half-truths. She spoke of sacrifices, of love, of how she'd only ever wanted the best for me. But her words rang hollow. For the first time, I let her know exactly how I felt. I spoke of the years of neglect, the constant feeling of being an outsider in my own home, and the pain of seeing my father's memory overshadowed by her new family. My voice didn't waver as I laid bare the hurt she'd caused. It wasn't about anger anymore, it was about honesty. I needed her to know the weight of her actions, even if she refused to acknowledge it. Catherine's response was a mixture of tears and defensiveness, but I didn't let it sway me. Mr. Walsh stepped in, presenting the legal documents that solidified my position. Catherine and Mike had no choice but to leave. Watching them pack up their belongings was both surreal and liberating. Each box they carried out felt like a piece of the tension lifting from my shoulders. By the end of the day, the house was quiet again. Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth stayed late, helping me clean and rearrange furniture. The house felt different now, like it was finally mine. As I sat in the living room that evening, the weight of the past few weeks settled over me. It wasn't just about reclaiming the house, it was about reclaiming myself. For the first time in years, I felt free. After the house was finally quiet, I set to work with Grandpa George and Aunt Elizabeth on restoring it to what it once was, a home. We began by clearing away the remnants of chaos left behind by Catherine and her family. Boxes of clutter were removed, walls were repainted, and furniture was rearranged. It wasn't just about cleaning, it was about reclaiming the space, making it mine again. With every room restored, it felt as though I was piecing myself back together. The process was therapeutic. Grandpa shared stories about how Dad had designed certain parts of the house, from the custom shelves in the living room to the garden beds in the backyard. Aunt Elizabeth brought in little touches to brighten the place, like fresh flowers and new curtains. Together, we planted a tree in the backyard, a symbol of renewal and growth. Slowly but surely, the house transformed from a battleground into a sanctuary. Catherine, however, wasn't ready to let go. She continued her efforts to exert control, using phone calls and family connections to pressure me. Relatives would call, trying to guilt me into reconciling or accusing me of tearing the family apart. But I was no longer the uncertain boy they remembered. With Grandpa's guidance and Mr. Walsh's legal support, I held my ground. I made it clear that my boundaries were non-negotiable, and eventually, the calls began to taper off. As time passed, I noticed a shift in how my extended family viewed me. The same relatives who had once doubted me now started to see the strength I had developed. They began to acknowledge the truth of my story, recognizing the resilience it took to stand up against Catherine's manipulations. For the first time, I felt respected, not just as a young man, but as someone capable of taking control of his own life. With the house fully restored, I decided to mark the new chapter of my life with a celebration. It wasn't a large gathering, just a small group of people who had stood by me when I needed them most. Grandpa George, Aunt Elizabeth, and a few close friends filled the house with laughter and warmth. It was the kind of day that reminded me of the joy Dad had always brought into our lives. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again, filled with love and the promise of brighter days ahead. 8 years later, the memories of those days are still vivid, but they've been joined by new ones. I've built a life I'm proud of. With hard work and determination, I turned my love for woodworking, a skill Dad had passed down to me, into a successful business. My company now creates custom furniture, and the home workshop where it all began remains my favorite place to create. More importantly, I've found happiness beyond the house. A year ago, I married Anna, a woman whose kindness and strength remind me of the support Aunt Elizabeth always gave me. Together, we've made the house our own, filling it with shared dreams and plans for the future. It's no longer just a symbol of my past, it's a foundation for everything I hope to build. Catherine reached out a few times over the years. Her voice on the other end of the line was hesitant, almost regretful. She wanted to reconnect, to rebuild what had been broken. But each time, I found myself unable to let her back in. I'd tell her gently but firmly that I wasn't ready. It wasn't about anger anymore, it was about protecting the peace and stability I'd fought so hard to create. Looking back, I see the journey for what it was, a test of resilience, a lesson in finding strength even in the darkest times. The house, once a source of pain, became a canvas for healing and growth. And while I'll never forget the struggles that brought me here, I've learned to focus on what lies ahead. For the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving. I'm thriving.